Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 159, The Science of Sherlock Holmes.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And together we are scientifically attuned to bringing you the best in Sherlockian talk radio. That's a thing, right?
Yeah, of course it's a thing. Absolutely.
Well, it's a thing that we have been doing since, July of 2007. Can you believe that? We are now heading into our 13th year.
Good grief.
I know. Crazy. Well, we are here to bring you the best of interviews with people from the world of Sherlock Holmes that are doing things that we find interesting or that we think that you should know about, and we bring them together and talk about them and their various and unique backgrounds. And today we have a wonderful conversation ready to go with E.J. Wagner, the crime historian. Before we get to EJ, I just want to remind you that we would appreciate your support of the show. If you go to ihearofsherlock.com, you will find links there to all sorts of things, including a PayPal and Patreon button that allows you to become a regular supporter. You may have seen some folks post pictures of an I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere mug over the holidays. Well, we are building that into our show support. If you support us at the $60 level on an annual basis, you will get a mug of your own with our logo and, of course, that famous phrase from Mycroft that you hear in the introduction, I hear of Sherlock everywhere, since you became his chronicler. At the $60 level. So check that out on ihearofsherlock.com and give us your support. And of course, show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/ihose159. You can find us at I Hear of Sherlock on all of the social networks, or at least the ones that matter, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And, of course, feel free to leave us a comment anywhere you can. We love hearing from you. We love to know that our shows reach you and that they affect you in a positive way. And now, speaking of a positive way, let's make our way over to the ancient and wonderful land of Wessex.
In the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, we are looking forward to Hogmanay and the tradition of first foot, gifts from the first person to cross our threshold after the stroke of midnight on the new year. But you will already have good fortune once you order your copy of The Science Fiction Worlds of Arthur Conan Doyle and H.G. Wells by Dana Martin Batory. These essays explore landmark science fiction, including the last Professor Challenger story, When the World Screamed, and it's available right now from our wessexpress.com. Ring out the old, ring in the new, ring out the false, ring in the true, ring out the want, the care, the sin, but ring the fuller minstrel in. Begin your new year by reaching for the pleasure only a volume from the West Express can provide. Choose yours today.
Oh, those happy, busy people.
I love hearing from them. Well, speaking of lovely, happy, busy people, let's talk to EJ. Crime historian and storyteller E.J. Wagner is the author of a book of scientific entertainment called The Science of Sherlock Holmes, and it's what we'll be talking with her about today. It was published by John Wiley & Sons and won the 2007 Edgar Award for the best critical biographical book published in 2006. E.J. has presented programs on the folklore and history of crime to audiences for, well, more years than she or we care to admit. She researches her material in places like the Armed Forces Museum of Pathology in Maryland, the Suffolk County Office of the Medical Examiner, the Crime Laboratory of London's Metropolitan Police, that's Scotland Yard, kids, the Phillips Library of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and she delves into ancient trial manuscripts and medical texts and judiciously eavesdrops in public places. E.J. has appeared in many settings, including the Brookhaven National Laboratory, Long Island University, the University of Nevada, Bayard Cutting Arboretum, and the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, among many other places. E.J. studied acting at the Piscator Dramatic Workshop and at Syracuse University and New York University, earning a degree in theater arts. She's an avid photographer and collector of old books pertaining to crime and medicine. E.J., welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
What a background you have. You're like a Renaissance woman.
I like to think of it that way, but I try not to let it go to my head.
That is wonderful. Well, we'd like to delve into some of this stuff, but we'll start with you the same way we start with all of our guests and ask you where on earth you first encountered Sherlock Holmes.
Well, I met him in the Bronx. Actually, I was going to junior high and on Mossville Parkway, and usually getting beaten up and bullied by my classmates because I'd been skipped 2.5 years and they resented it. Also, I was probably a bit of a pain. So I was very delighted when my English teacher, his name was Benjamin Weinstein, decided that during lunch hour he would take those of us who were interested into the park with our sandwich lunches and read to us from books that were not on the curriculum but that he felt we should be exposed to. And one day it was a Sherlock Holmes book. And the next thing I knew, I was in the library taking out the collected works. And it was always sort of something I wanted to do something with, but I couldn't quite figure out how. Until one day, I was working at an outreach program at Stony Brook University, Museum of Long Island Natural Sciences. And my job was to get the public in there to be entertained and then to be exposed to the collection. And I did a program on werewolves, and I did a program on the history of witchcraft, all of which, you notice, were against the law. And one day I did one on the history of forensic science, and this would have evolved into a program called Science and Sherlock Holmes. And it was really more about Conan Doyle, the real cases that he had become involved in investigating. And one day, I got an email labeled Query, and it was from a man who said he was an editor at Wiley, and would I be interested in writing a book called The Science of Sherlock Holmes? So I figured he was a lunatic. And I only answered it because the bread that I was waiting to rise had not yet finished. So I asked something about what he had in mind, and it turned out that this was from Wiley, a major publisher. And he was not crazy, and he had a very definite idea of what he wanted, because they were doing a series on, the science of this, the art of science of other major issues. It was sort of a group of books. And out of these discussions came this book.
So what happened to you professionally, what led you to where you were in the museum?
You mean my life in crime?
Yes,
well,
yes.
My husband and I had been living in the city. When one day he casually mentioned to me that his company was moving further out on Long Island. And I quickly realized that was going to involve a 2-hour commute each way for him. So we frantically bought a house within 24 hours. And as my kids got older, I'd been writing, doing freelance writing for political parties and so on, speeches. Part of my job was to teach the candidate how to give the speech effectively, not just to put the words together. And then I had a little more time because my kids were bigger and didn't need constant supervision. I figured 22 hours a day was enough. And I heard about this museum that was attached to the science department at the university. And I called them up and asked them if they by any chance needed a storyteller who told stories for adults. And they said, come rush right over. And they did. And they offered me the job. I had to teach 2 classes, one in dissection of all things. And I just brought in a big audience. People love hearing about crime.
Now, when you say you taught a class in dissection, are we talking a scientific?
No, not people, just, unfortunate small animals.
Well, even so, that takes a degree of skill and nearly artistry. I mean, if we're talking about the process, did you have any experience?
Well, I did. I had in high school I had a class in dissection, and
okay.
I went to the Bronx High School of Science for one miserable year, where I had the biology classes were pretty advanced, and I'm a cook, and taking apart animals is part of the cook's lore,
That's true. That is true. You must be a riot around Thanksgiving.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But I've seen worse things. I've worked a lot with the medical examiners out here in Suffolk County. And I remember once we were all standing around this deceased person, and they're talking about odd things that happen. And someone told us about a guy who had been found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs, and his wife had covered him with a flowered sheet, which was brought in, and there was a knife, a carving knife stuck in the middle of his chest. And of course, the issue was going to be, was this self-inflicted, or did she lose her temper? She called up while this was going on and made sure that we would return the sheet and the knife. And someone said, of course, Thanksgiving's coming.
Oh, my goodness.
So how did you get into this? I mean, were you the sort of kid who was out, in the parks, and when you came across a beetle or a small animal, you sort of took it home and looked at it under a magnifying glass? I mean, were you always interested in nature and science?
I was always interested in it, but one of the things that really started me is I had a cousin who's 27 years older than I. He was the eldest, and I was the youngest of my grandmother's 10 grandchildren. And he was a pathologist, and he invited me over to the New York City Medical Examiner's office to see what he did. And I became absolutely fascinated and kept going back. And he taught me more and more and more about it. And we had vague plans to someday write a book about it together. And then he told me one day that I was going to have to find someone else to work with because he was getting severe memory problems. And then he started to describe to me the perfect pathologist to work with, whom I like to joke, sounded like a cross between a very good-natured St. Bernard and Albert Schweitzer. But by luck, when I did some of these public programs at the university out here in Stony Brook, a whole bunch of people from the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's office showed up as members of the audience. And one of them, Leo Del Cortivo, who was the director of laboratories, called me up the next day and asked if I'd be interested in doing some research over there. And it was. And they were all extremely helpful to me. In some ways, more helpful than my cousin, because he was always close to the field, because I would get infected and bring it home to the kids, and it was always an issue. Out here in Suffolk County, they didn't know me, so they just said, okay, stick your hand in here. And I said, but that's a dead person. And they said, yes, but you have to feel where the vertebrae was separated. That was the spot where her life ended. And they kind of guided my hand through, and I felt that spot. But the thing was, after it was all over, I went out and ate lunch.
So I think if people were looking for words to describe you on the list, there would not be the word squeamish.
Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that make me squeamish, but let's not get into politics.
Okay.
No politics. No. Oh, except Victorian politics.
Oh, there you go.
All right, that's fair.
As you looked to Sherlock Holmes, I mean, obviously the stories are filled with, scientific references and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
When we talked about this on our other podcast on Trifles, that even when the experiments are done, it's really more the result that's focused on rather than the process, simply because that's, as far as a storyteller goes, that's where the action is, right?
Well, I do think that Mr. Holmes, who was a fictional character, taught us something that's very real. First of all, the careful taking of notes, observing the scene without disturbing it. Sounds so obvious to us today, but that was a novelty. I mean, the guys used to come in there, and the first thing they would do is start looking for money. Is anything gone? Sometimes, frankly, things got lifted. It was chaotic. The investigating officer suddenly had access to someone's valuables. Not everybody was completely honest, so things would disappear. And sometimes these were things that were needed in order to establish what happened. So just that pressure on, we have to take note of everything, where it was, how it was handled, who touched it. And it was a completely radical approach in those days. And these fictional stories made the necessity of doing this understandable to the readers. And so that when they needed money to establish, pay pathologists, pay people to perform this kind of work, the public was much more apt to accept this than they would have been, 20 years before.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was frankly a little surprised in reading through your book in realizing just how nascent the profession was at the time Sherlock Holmes came along. That some of the things that we just take for granted these days, even some of the things that appear in the stories, were simply not part of common practice at the time. And I was particularly taken by a quote from the preface where you say, Sherlock Holmes may have been fictional, but what we learn from him is very real.
Well, I think that's true. People tend to forget that the British public was extremely resistant to even having a police force. They felt it was an infringement of their privacy and their independence. They had a system called the Bow Street Runners, thief takers, who, for a price, would look for your stolen goods. And it was amazing how often they found them, probably because they'd taken it in the first place. So it became evident after a while that the system was so corrupt, there simply had to be a state-run police force. There was not a Scotland Yard laboratory, did not exist until 1935. It used to just be sort of signed out to individual pathologists and individual detectives.
Wow.
But there was no organized scientific investigative body.
That's amazing to think of these days. So what do you think was the turning point? What was the thing that really started pushing police detective work toward a forensic bent, toward more of a scientific approach?
Well, I think that mostly it started in Middle Europe. I think journalism growing, British people began to read more and heard about what they were doing in Hungary, for instance, and in Berlin. there was a lot written there. The famous Vidocq, the thief turned spy for the police in France, he published his memoir, and it was translated into English, and it was a very popular book. And all this kind of aroused a great interest in it. And I think probably the written word had everything to do with it. People read more. Always a good thing, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
So when you started your conversations, with Wiley about the book, how did all this take shape in your mind? I ask because, what you've done here is really interesting and wonderful on so many levels. First of all, in each chapter, you end each chapter with a little section in the back called Whatever Remains, where, you pull out true facts true facts, as if there's any other kind. You pull out facts and events,
facts.
That are related to what you've talked about before, that are really interesting, that it's great that you didn't sort of leave these behind. And the breadth of this, is so wide. I mean, everything from footprints to disguises to the basic science to sanitation and so on. So how did all this, so you get off the phone with Wiley and they say, sure. How did all this take shape?
Well, we, after I said I would be interested in doing it, they asked me for a proposal. And I remember that I had written a proposal years ago, which didn't have Sherlock Holmes in it, but it was about ancient crimes and how they related to the way we solve crimes today. And so I sent that old proposal to Stephen Power, who was the editor who had contacted me. And he liked that proposal very much. He said, let us rework this, but using Sherlock Holmes as the jumping off point. And once that clicked into my head, and I got pregnant with this idea, it just sort of happened. I looked over all the lectures and the performances I'd given at the university and so on, and pulled out something from here and something for there. The things I used to do at the university had everything to do with this. I had one program called, Autopsy of a Vampire. Catchy title, though. And what I had been doing in that program was comparing the folklore about vampires to what actually happened. Some of these bodies were dug up, and it did look very much as though they had moved in the coffin and so on. How did this happen? And the folklore, of course, had this all coming out of, someone bit somebody on the neck or something. But there were good reasons for this to happen, applying natural science. So that was the kind of skeleton I built the book around.
Well, it's fascinating. And, it's interesting you touch upon vampirism, because one of the wonderful points that you relate to the reader in the book is that as recently as 1875, if I'm remembering it correctly, people would disinter their deceased relatives because they wanted to protect them from vampirism.
Well, usually what happened in those cases, they believed that tuberculosis was brought about by vampires. And that's only certain parts of the United States. It was in New England. And what they would do is if they thought that they had buried an ancestor who may have been a vampire, they would open the coffin and remove the head and put it between the legs, which we know because we have re-exhumed several of these and found them. And that was the purpose.
Well, now, has anybody done the true scientific study to see if the people who performed that odd act on their deceased ancestors actually were free of tuberculosis? I mean, it could have been.
Now, the thing is, it's a very long latent period before tuberculosis becomes evident, before these symptoms become obvious.
Oh, all right.
And this is one reason they didn't realize that you could acquire it from your relative who's dying in the back room and not show it for years. They thought that dead person had walked.
Oh, I see. That's fascinating.
Whatever you think about disease, you're always looking at it through the prism of what we believe at the moment. For centuries, they were telling us that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. Now, I'm sure that stress does not make stomach pains feel better, but that's not the cause. And it took a doctor fairly recently to demonstrate he had to actually infect himself with H. pylori, and that was what was causing it.
Wow.
So, yeah, and once you have it in the household, everybody starts getting it, so then they think it's inherited.
Well, one of the really nice things about the many nice things about the book here is your ability to connect the dots on all of these things, the latency period of tuberculosis to this bizarre activity. And in one of the chapters, I just opened up the book, in your chapter on the crime scene by gaslight, you start with Holmes in a study in scarlet. He whipped a tape measure and a large round magnifying glass from his pocket, and with these two implements he trotted noiselessly about the room, sometimes stopping, occasionally kneeling, once lying flat on his face. And, you have that whole lovely excerpt there. And then you go on and say, at just about the same time, Conan Doyle was writing those words. Across the sea in Vienna, Hans Gross, the brilliant professor of criminology, was composing the standards for investigating what he called the scene of the offense. So do you have the sense that Conan Doyle was ahead of his time, or was he, or was it a coincidence, or was he in tune with his age?
Well, he was very interested in what was happening in Europe, and so I think he had more access to I don't think he did a formal study of it. There are many errors in science in his books. Sorry, but that's true. I know there's a great fuss about how Holmes discovers a test for hemoglobin, but there already had been a test that was very accurate and frequently performed, and it was already performed and it presented in a British court. So I think, and as we know, there are a lot of odd things in the stories where people's names change and the wives come and go. And so I think he was just having a good time writing this. And as we know, Conan Doyle got to a point he started to feel that Sherlock Holmes was an albatross around his neck. And he wanted to get rid of him, but he couldn't. He tried shoving him over the falls, the Reichenbach Falls, and then he had to bring him back by popular demand.
Yes. Well, and that actually, kind of spurs a question. I mean, we acknowledge Conan Doyle as pretty much the father of detective fiction. I mean, obviously Wilkie Collins and Poe before him had their own contributions, but it was really Sherlock Holmes that brought this knowledge into the public sphere at a scale that was never seen before. And since then, look at Otto Penzler. I mean, he runs an entire publishing empire and bookstore based on crime fiction. What is it, do you think, that constantly captures the public's interest and intrigue about crime fiction as a genre?
Well, I think almost all great works of art are about crime in one way or another, if you think about it. I mean, opera is full of murders, suicides, and other unpleasantness, because that's where the conflict is between a calm, ordered society. Something happens to break the order. Someone must restore the order. All of Shakespeare is the same thing. Something. It's like a grit in your eye. You've got to get it out. Once it's there, you have to know what it is, where it is, get rid of it. And I think so. I think a great deal of wonderful works of art are built around just that, the threat and the resolvement.
Well, one of the recent illustrations of this is in how the world of Sherlock Holmes has been brought to life in the international exhibition of Sherlock Holmes. And we had in one of our recent podcasts the designers and organizers of the exhibition, and we talked a little bit about what happens when you progress through the exhibition. And really the bringing that world, that Victorian criminal world to life, those investigations, these details, this grit in your eye that you're trying to resolve, this knotty problem you're trying to unpack, has a lot of forensic science associated with it, and you were instrumental in all of those components in the exhibition. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that and
sure,
what you think about all that?
Well, Jeffrey Curley, who was working with the exhibitionists, the exhibition development group, had reached out to me and asked me if I would serve as a consultant on forensic history for and this muddled along for a year or so. We would have telephone conferences, which kept getting interrupted by static. They would ask me detailed questions. I would provide detailed answers. And I remember one particular, I told them my husband was very ill at the time, and I said, I cannot travel right now. So everything has to be either email or over the phone. I simply can't do it. So there was one great big meeting they had, and I was in Colorado or something. Everybody else was in the room. Everyone who worked on this project, there must have been 30 people. And I was supposed to get in by Skype. Well, something was going wrong with the system. It kept cutting off. Finally, I said, the heck with this. Went upstairs, took a shower, washed my hair, wrapped up my sopping head in a towel, went down again, looked at the computer, and his voice came out, said, push the little button on the right. So I pushed the little button on the right and discovered to my horror that turned on a camera. And there I was with my dripping wet hair and the towel, facing these 30 people sitting around a table fully dressed. My debut. So that was how it worked. Jeffrey was very nice about accommodating this medical issue we had at the time. And that was how we did it.
Well, how did you go about, because one of the things that happens is you're presented with a crime scene. You know something has happened. There's been someone who's been, let's say, seriously injured, and you have a crime scene. There's a drawing room. There are tables overturned. There's a broken bust, et cetera, et cetera. How did all that get assembled? Because as you go on in your own investigation, and what happens is you, the viewer, get to investigate this crime, you look at a variety of things, including the pattern of blood spots, the tracks, the path, a ballistic path a bullet might take, and so on. How did all that noodle out?
Well, Dan Stashower wrote essentially the script for this, concocted the story, and ran it by me, and I picked at the scientific issue of what did they know at the time, if this is when this crime took place, what would they have done, how would they have handled the evidence, and so on. And then the people who designed these very complicated interactive things went to work on it. At the very end of the exhibit, you see a number of forensic scientists being interviewed. Those were all people I'd worked with that we conned into doing this. It's very interesting because some of the things have changed even since then. For instance, there's a certain question now about blood patterns. We know more about the variables. If a window is open and blood is spurting and there's a strong wind, it may disturb the pattern, that kind of thing. It's not that cut and dried. On television, they're always coming in and saying, okay, this is obviously the assailant stood here and it was there, and this is why we have, and it's just not that easy. How many variables are there? Can we account for them? Sherlock Holmes said, once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains must be the truth. But how can you be certain that you have eliminated the impossible? It always may be something you didn't know.
Oh, that is interesting.
When I look over old cases, which I do all the time, it can be so frustrating. You read about a man who was convicted and executed, and you realize that he couldn't have done it. Not the way they said he did. Because we know more now. It's very frustrating because I can't do anything about an executed innocent man 100 years later.
So when that's interesting, looking backwards at cases, investigations, and science, and how knowledge that you don't have, discoveries yet to come, may influence that. When you look back on everything you have in the Science of Sherlock Holmes, the footprint impressions, the ballistics, the shot in the dark, the crime scene investigation, the poisons, the disguises, the doctors who turned out after they had passed away to have been women all along, the poisoning. Does anything stand out? I mean, as you put this together and you look back on the whole history of crime and science in this age, are there one or two things that really stand out to you as the most remarkable, the most disturbing, the most memorable?
Well, one of the things that has always bothered me is when people write fiction about crime, is they keep on making the same mistakes. There was, by the way, a more recent edition of this book that Barnes and Noble put out, and it has a chapter in it which is not in the original. And the new edition has a chapter that I wrote for it called "The Excessively Expressive Corpse," because in fiction, someone is always dying clutching a handkerchief or some essential evidence. And yet, actually, when someone dies, the muscles relax. There is such a thing as instantaneous rigor. But it's highly, highly unusual. And I've interviewed any number of medical examiners that they'll tell me I've seen 2 cases in my life. Usually you see this in battle. And someone dies in the heat of a battle and they're terribly emotionally aroused. And they die suddenly. Sometimes the hands will clench something. But it just almost never happens ordinarily. And yet fiction writers are constantly doing that. And then there was this old belief that the hair and nails grow after death. And they don't. It's been demonstrated. What happens is the skin and the muscles contract, so it appears as though it has grown. And yet there is one crime writer who's still putting the stuff in to this day. He must have the world's oldest pathology book and has never brought a new one.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, here's something scary. If you read old medical books that were published, 1895, that kind of thing, and they are so definite about certain things that we now know are simply not true, you start to wonder about what's being published today.
Yeah. So, are you tempted, just in the course of your regular life, because of all the knowledge that you have, to form certain opinions or to look into some of these persistent cases that crop up in the tabloids? Poor old John Benet Ramsey. Have you ever been tempted to look into the Ripper crimes and things like that? What did you think about Patricia? What was her name? Who a couple of years ago did a sort of her own DNA search for Ripper evidence.
It was just absolute nonsense. I'm sorry. First of all, the trouble with these old cases, you go looking at the physical evidence, even when it still exists, there's no chain of evidence of custody. You don't know who's handled it. When you take a DNA sample today, they're very careful mostly about who touched it, who handled it. Every person who put their fingers anywhere near it has to sign for it. But when you look at the old crimes, that they didn't preserve anything. I remember that Sickert the painter was supposed to have, it's nonsense. And then the papers pick it up, DNA expert. But they didn't have real experts there, because a real expert would not get involved in something like that. It would damage his or her reputation.
Mm-hmm.
Because the first thing you would say is, who collected the specimen? How has it been kept? Was it temperature controlled? Who else has handled it since in the 100 years since this happened? They haven't even established reliably that there was only one Jack the Ripper. Copycat crimes? At any rate, you couldn't prove it because Anglo-Saxon justice requires that you face your accuser and confront the evidence. And whoever did it is obviously unable to do that. He's indisposed permanently.
Now, the additional chapter that you just mentioned, the excessively expressive corpse and the canon, that also appeared in the BSI Press publication,
That's right.
Nerve and Knowledge, right?
Right. And the thing is, when Barnes and Noble bought the reprint rights from Turner, I mean, Wiley sold off that whole
series,
science and law section to Turner. I didn't realize that. I thought only ball players got sold, but it turned out I was too. So Turner is still putting out the original edition, so you can buy that anywhere.
Okay.
Barnes and Noble wanted to just do a limited run, and they wanted a new chapter, and I had the rights to do this because BSI had the arrangement I had with them was I had control over that chapter once they had been allowed to use it once. So I told the guy at Barnes and Noble that they could have the chapter for a reasonable sum of money, and the arrangement was made, so I was able to resell it.
Well, that's great. So no matter where people turn, they can find
it. The thing about that run at Barnes and Noble, it sold out almost immediately, and they are trying to figure out whether they want to reprint it or not. I do not understand the publishing business at all. I sometimes think they get up in the morning and have a meeting deciding which foot to shoot themselves in. But at any rate, it is. You can find it. You can get the BSI book, and some libraries have it.
Yeah.
So, but if by chance the publishing world did get up one morning and try to decide and held a meeting to decide which foot to shoot themselves in, you could administer a paraffin test and find out.
Well, the paraffin test isn't all that great.
One thing I wanted to ask you with respect to this chapter, obviously the expression of the corpse after death, as you very clearly laid out, muscles relax. It's simply a natural state of things. Conan Doyle, of course, made that mistake with Sir Charles Baskerville, who was, frightened to death by the legend of the Hound. And they said his face, let's see, Sir Charles' person, the evidence of, an almost incredible facial distortion is the way, he was described in death. We know that's not the case now, but obviously it makes for a great story. But what about another case in the canon where facial distortion was actually induced by a poison? And of course, I'm talking about the rictus that was induced by Tommy's arrows. Yeah, in the Sign of Four. What about that?
Well, there are. I say it does exist, just that it's very, very rare. And crime writers, including Conan Doyle, use it excessively. I've often wondered about Conan Doyle whether it was because he just didn't care and it made a good story, or whether because he had seen military service and he'd seen a lot of violence, and it's violent scenes in battle that he may have had the impression it was more common than it actually was.
Could be. Of course, in those days we didn't hear of the Andaman Islands too often, and these days we hear about the Andamans more and more in the news and in various places.
Well, I think there are places in Scandinavia where they think everybody's blonde.
Oh, the more you know.
It's a self-selected group.
Right. The more you know. So, for those interested, the chapters in the Science of Sherlock Holmes really span the array of scientific knowledge that we get about Sherlock Holmes and his practices, from autopsies to myths and legends to insects and footprints and geology and handwriting and blood and much more. EJ, do you think there are elements of the forensics that could have been included in the Sherlock Holmes stories as Conan Doyle wrote them? You know, we know he was ahead of his time, but are there other areas that you might have been interested seeing represented in the stories?
Oh, yeah. I think anthropology is one.
Talk about that.
But I'll tell you something interesting. There's a professor of anthropology out in, I think it's South Carolina, who has built a whole course around this book and uses it as a textbook. A lot of forensic groups use it as a textbook because it's fun to read. You know, it's serious science, but it's written amusingly, I think. Anyway, it amuses me. I reread it every so often. And they find their students really enjoy reading it, so it's not a chore, which was my idea. Because when I really got into writing this book, and by the way, there is also an Audible version.
Oh, wonderful.
Available through Audible. Yeah. Well, I read it myself, and there was this great argument as to whether I was going to read it or I shouldn't read it. I don't know. It's not a fun job, let me tell you. But my husband said to me, of all the people who would be interested in this, from Sherlockians to forensic students to law students, which group are you most interested in communicating with? And I had to say it was the forensic people who helped me so much. And because it was pointed out to me that an actor reading this, someone who didn't have a scientific background, would have a terrible time pronouncing all of the medical terms. And this is perfectly true. As a matter of fact, there was one section where I'm talking about a moth with a very long proboscis. And it had a long, complicated Latin name. And the argument now was, how did I pronounce it? Well, I discovered this at 10 o'clock one night, and we were going to be recording the following morning, and I had no idea of how the hell you pronounced it. And I tried the computer and everything, and I wasn't getting anywhere. So I started emailing entomologists all over the world saying, how do you pronounce it? And everyone had a different answer. And finally, one of them said to me, look, we all pronounce it the way our professor pronounced it, whoever he was. Make one up. And that's pretty much how I had to do some of this.
Well, it's interesting, you know, the influence of the people you learn from on how you tend to practice and so on. I'm curious, you know, with all of this, are there writers, you know, you mentioned some egregious things that are completely inaccurate, but are there writers you admire today because you think, boy, you know, these people, now here's somebody who really got it right. Is there anybody like that?
I tell you the truth, I don't read that much of it. I don't read that much fiction, crime fiction, because I don't want to get mixed up. And I avoid pastiches. Not because I think there's anything wrong with them, but because you start confusing which was the real Conan Doyle story, which was not. So what I tend to read mostly when I'm not grumbling about politics is I read a lot of old medical books, old law books, and I'm cooking up a couple of new projects. So
interesting, medical and law. Have you ever read any of the Thorndike stories by Austin Freeman?
Yes, I did.
So what do you think about that? Now there, you know, is the medico-legal specialist who traveled everywhere with his invaluable green canvas-covered case and made much of Austin Freeman's actually working out a lot of these things. I mean, what's your review?
Well, I haven't read it in a long time, but I remember thinking that he did not have that thread of humor that goes through the Conan Doyle stories, which I find very endearing. Well, the atmosphere is just not quite as good. I don't find that his characters have not as interesting eccentricities, which I think is one of the things that makes Sherlock Holmes so vivid.
Oh, yeah. Well, Austin, yeah. Well, Freeman himself was not a barrel of laughs.
No.
But what's your sense of the science? Do you remember any of the things Thorndike used to do?
The thing is, I would have to reread it and have to see at the time he was writing what we knew.
Mm.
Because quite a lot of time has gone past. So I don't really recall. It did not make an enormously strong impression on me.
Mm.
I have it in my library, but then I have a lot of things in my library, including a great deal about Labrador retrievers. Well, when I was writing this book, our last lab was with me, Dr. Watson.
Faithful companion.
Faithful companion. He would snooze on my feet while I wrote.
That's wonderful. Well, the book is The Science of Sherlock Holmes, From Baskerville Hall to the Valley of Fear, the real forensics behind the great detective's greatest cases by E.J. Wagner. You can find it certainly at Barnes & Noble, pretty much anywhere books are sold.
Amazon has it. May I say Amazon?
You may.
Sure.
Absolutely. And you may find E.J. Wagner at ejwagnercrimehistorian.com. E.J., thank you so much for taking the time to share your very unique story with us and your wonderful sense of humor.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I don't know if it's, the interest in all things related to death or what, but I find that people that have, this interest in the macabre have a sense of humor. That is, it's a gallows kind of humor, and it's absolutely delightful. So it was wonderful to hear EJ kind of making a few jokes here and there related to this very somber subject.
I think it's part of humanity, to have that sort of perspective and distance that humor gives on some of these topics. But it's more than just sort of a somber subject. I mean, if people are sort of like you and I, who have this sort of side interest in science and how things really work, this review and the historical review and the detail about some of these processes and how some of this research really happens and the actions of poisons and interestingly too, the connection to witchcraft and magic. I mean, that's something that Michael Harrison, the writer, was also interested in. I love how all this fits together. And then, of course, there's Les Klinger's interest in Dracula as a literary property and the other associated legends. It just reminds me of how much fun all this is.
Absolutely. And how many different angles we can come at it by. And really what people will make of this in another 100 years. I think EJ made a great point about, we live in the present with regard to science and medicine. And what will we have discovered 100 years hence that'll make us look completely foolish now?
Yeah. Yes, we'll discover in 100 years that the people who are really interested in phrenology had it all right, and all you need to do is put your hand on the top of somebody's head and you can figure out what's going on with them.
Well, it is, that sound means it's time to figure out what's going on with the Canonical Couplets, that quiz show that you've come to know and love here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. If you recall, in the last episode, that is episode 158, we gave you this clue. When an old man's desire makes him climb a tree, Holmes thinks, you can't make a monkey out of me. Bert, what story does that refer to?
That is the terrific story, The Adventure of the Creeping Vine.
Well, you're halfway there. If you swing out on that vine a la Tarzan, you will find that it is actually The Adventure of the Creeping Man.
Oh, I was so close, so close.
Well, we did have a number of entries, once again, a number of correct entries. So we will spin the big prize wheel here, watching as it comes around and slows down, and it pauses on number 15, and that corresponds to Tom Huntington. So, Tom, congratulations. We will be reaching out to you and making arrangements with you to send you a prize from the iHose vaults this time around. And now, get yourselves ready, for it is time for the Canonical Couplet for episode 159. That's this episode. Are you ready? Here we go. A Christmas Tale, one of the best produced, left the sad culprit permanently goosed. If you think you know the answer to this one, and you should, please send us an email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. Put Canonical Couplet in the subject line, and if you are among the people who have guessed correctly, we will pick your name at random to participate in episode 160. Good luck. All right. Well, this is the final episode before we end up in New York for the BSI weekend. Like we said in some of our earlier episodes, if you come up to either one of us, to Bert or myself, and whisper iHose in our ear, we will not only giggle with delight and squeal, but we may actually have a little something for you. So give that a shot if you see either one of us at the BSI weekend at various events.
Yes, I always like to go to the BSI weekend and hang on to Scott's wallet. And when people come up and whisper iHose to me, I give them one of those little pictures of the presidents that he's carefully printed and folded in there. It's a lot of fun. And in fact, it's our salute this year to Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, I was actually planning on giving away my Donald Trump $3 bills. Is that feasible?
Oh, dear. Can't you, look, if somebody brings a $3 bill to the bank, can't you get 2.5 Nixons for it?
Well, I am not a crook. And until next time, I will remain the crookless Scott Monty.
And I remain the free and easy Bert Wolder.
And together we say, the game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, good old President Hamilton.